Welcome to Global Forum, a platform for discussion of global issues from global perspectives. Today's topic is a very important one that concerns the very medium that we are using itself, and that will be the notion of new frontiers of communication involving internet, television, telephone, and other technologies, and how that's impacting the human society. This is first of a series of discussions, and we promise we'll bring people from all over the world to participate in these panel discussions as we go along. Today we have two very distinguished guests here. My first guest is Professor Kien. He is a professor specializing in media studies, globalization and culture. All three topics tie in very well with the discussion we want to have today. Next is my other learned colleague, Professor Valerie Smith, and she specializes in interpersonal communication, intercultural communication, and conflict communication. I welcome you both.
Thank you.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Now let's start with talking about a book that you may not necessarily like very much, Professor Kien. That is Alvin Toffler's two books. That is Third Wave and his recent book, Power Shift. How do you look at the notion of third wave, where he says humanity now has entered an entirely new mode of communication, where all five major spheres, including technosphere, infosphere, sociosphere, political sphere, have changed, and success in each requires totally different skills and totally different techniques. What's your reflection on that conception?
Well, I actually had the pleasure of hearing Alvin Toffler speak at some point, and he thankfully has a good sense of humor about his own predictive powers, and is very, I think, reflective on his own position. That said, I think that he is making a point with an agenda, and I think that there's a lot of meat to what he's saying. At the same time, is always the other side to technology, and I think one of the popular reactions to technology is to fall into the techno-determinist position and just see technology as driving us forward. I'd like to try to balance that out by considering what the socio-cultural implications are in the uptake of technology. So while technology does enable us to do quite a number of things that we envision doing and fulfills our, I suppose, communicative evolutionary drive, at the same time, culture and society play a huge role in determining what uses we will put our technologies to. And I think that, especially in terms of the present situation, the rapid development of digital technology in the latter part of the 20th century and our current circumstances led to a lot of perhaps misunderstandings about how technology actually comes into play. The internet, for example, arose through a very programmatic developmental process, then went through a phase where it was very much like a Wild West frontier. And I think at present what we're seeing now is the social, cultural, and as a result legal manifestation or influence, I suppose, on the use of this technology. So for some time, I think we were prone to a bit of hyperbole about the potentiality of this technology. And what we're starting to see now is actually a more, I suppose, systemic response to it, in which we're making very important cultural and social and political decisions about what we're really going to allow this technology to do.
You set the agenda for us very well. Let's go to our colleague here. One of the points that our colleague Kien made was whether or not technology has a transformative power, whether or not we can think of techno-determinism, you know. Mm-hmm. And even Heidegger says in his book on technology is highly transformative. He says the difference between old technology and new technology is old technology was instrumental, only extension of human capabilities, and new technology is a ready reserve and also a source of transformation. It transformed its own, originated its own creator. What's your take on this?
Well, similar to my colleague here, I am also not a strong technological determinist in that I don't think...
Does it mean you're a mild technological determinist?
It means I'm in the middle. I do think technology affects communication and it affects relationships, but it's not the only factor that affects communication and relationships. There are social factors and cultural factors. And I think if we look back through history to older types of communication that are still existing today, and then bring it up to the time of the internet, that helps to give us the context for such a discussion. We've had some scholars say 4, some scholars say 5 eras of communication. And the first, of course, is pre-literate or oral societies. And this is where the technology of writing had not yet been introduced. Characteristics of communication in those societies, and we still have societies like that today, but characteristics of communication include communication being immediate, face-to-face, include communication being poetic in many ways. If you look at, if you grew up in the United States, for example, and someone said, row, row, row your boat, if you haven't heard that song for 20 or 30 years, you can finish the rest gently down the stream because it has that rhyme and poetry that helps us to remember it. And so before writing, we had many techniques that were repetitious and that the elders in the tribe told the community the stories and passed on the oral tradition. And communication it was situational. It was in the setting of being, having all the factors of nonverbal communication and emotion being expressed through the face, especially in the eye contact and as well as the gestures and all of these aspects. And yet communication changes when you introduce the technology of writing. And so it does help to determine communication. It helps to communicate, determine the effects in some ways. For example, with writing, putting ideas down on words, we're losing that face-to-face, we're losing that immediacy, but at the same time, we're gaining the power to, some say, to have abstract thinking, because we can put things down and we don't have to occupy our mind to remember that part anymore when it's down on paper. And then we can develop the next thought and the next thought and the next thought to have that abstract thinking and complex ideas and theories instead of the repetition of the stories and so forth. And so that's one example of, when ownership of ideas comes into play. And then,
may I interrupt you, remind you? Ultimately, what I want to know from you is, can technology transform people into its own creators? These are all good examples of previous technologies. Is modern technology in any position to transform its own creators beyond what they had intended it to do? And the best example that Dr. gives, I think, is that of a machine which he says stored of human labor. And then he says, now we're in the era of computer which is stored of intelligence. And he said, imagine a situation, you are at work, and you get a call, the call is coming from your computer, home computer calls you, and says, I read the news today for weather, and discovered 3 leaks in the roof. I have called 3 people who will fix it, here are the 3 invoices. You order me one, you can authorize one, and I'll get it fixed before you get home. That's a totally different kind of interaction between technology and person. Is that possible, and what's the consequence of that if that happens?
Yeah, I think there's positive and there's negative consequences. Definitely the positive consequences, it can simplify and make our lives easier. It can help us avoid difficult, and we're like seamlessly integrated with knowledge at our fingertips, immediately that we need to make decisions.
But those are all examples of technology and its instrumentality, expansion of our capabilities, expansion of our memory function. But does it go beyond that, I'm asking you?
Well, as a you brought up Heidegger, and of course, I've published.
That's more reason you should tell me.
And so I would have to agree with Heidegger's position that yes, the inframing technology as an inframing does have the potential to impact us in huge ways. At the same time, I think that it bears keeping in mind McLuhan's notion of remediation, that what actually new technology does is remediate old technology. So much of what we have historically gained in terms of our communicative and thinking processes gets preserved in the new media.
Mm-hmm.
And in the process of creating new media, I think what we end up with is something like what Leibniz imagined is the potential for other ways of thinking, other ways of doing things, because these other processes have been mechanized to the extent that we no longer need to concern ourselves with them so much. And so I would agree with the statement Toffler makes, but I would want to add more to it and say, yes, that's definitely an important aspect of technological advancement. At the same time, we still preserve much of what we do and always have done culturally and socially. And as an example, a case study that I use in my book, Global Technography, I look at how we actually use the cell phone to replace the wallet photo. So traditionally, before the advent of cell phones, we might carry around wallet photos, show each other pictures from our wallets, and we would build community in this way. Well, we still perform much the same in the present context, but now, of course, we're used to seeing pictures on each other's phones instead of from the wallet. And so that's an example of how we remediate and at the same time preserve our cultural performativity.
But won't you say, Professor Kien, that in that notion of remediation, one leaves out then two things. One is emergence of new functions and new conceptions of relationship. And secondly is new possibilities. Alvin Toffler, for instance, says one final major systemic outcome of this is creation of an intelligence environment. That ultimately we create an intelligence environment which in turn begins to change not only our thinking pattern but the very structure of human brain. The brain itself goes through physical transformation. So it's a very complex situation where we create an intelligent environment which begins to change the way we think, act, and relate. And then at the end, the final product of that is the whole sort of framework of our mind, and the brain structure itself is altered. How do we account for that fact?
Well, I'm not a biologist and nor a psychiatrist, but I'd want to be presented with some pretty strong evidence, very conclusive evidence that technology has the ability to change the way my brain is wired. I think that
a number of studies being done. Charlie Rose had one of the Indian American, some gentleman from India who's now here in the United States, who's heading a study, I think at UCLA or UC Davis, one of the two. And he has shown, not conclusive, I think is a different word, and it varies from person to person, but gave a lot of interesting examples of how his project is looking at human brain and what he calls mirror cells, through which I recognize certain things about you and you recognize certain. And they're looking at different parts of the brain and how brain itself is going through changes, and now how through medical intervention we can make those changes more directed. So there are these elements. So we are in a very complex process. Not only our bodies are being changed, our minds are being, our thought patterns are being changed, our culture is being changed, and then I don't want to again ignore the fact that you made. So I'm asking you is the more complex question again. On one hand, we have a major transformative force unleashed around us. On the other hand, we become so conscious of our own power in this context. So there's double mediation going on in the sense. We are self-conscious, we are Shakespeare's characters who read Shakespeare, and we are back on the stage again, having read him already, that kind of consciousness. What's the impact of that double consciousness in this regard?
the impact of double, can I just ask you to restate the...
Yeah, double consciousness, I mean, is one is consciousness in the moment I'm acting on like interviewing you right now.
Mm-hmm.
Second is my consciousness as a person who knows the role of technology, its power on me, and my ability to use it for different purposes. And all kinds of a matrix of choices that is presented to me, which was never known even to the emperor of a whole empire. Previously didn't have these choices that I have today. It's a totally new vista. So I'm saying, therefore, double consciousness, one of immediacy, second enhanced consciousness of technology and opportunity opens up. How do we deal with that?
Well, that's an interesting question. I tend to avoid that type of double think about technology in my work. And my specialty is in how we actually use technology in everyday life. Philosophically, I don't know if we actually walk around in a cognizant state of having two different mindsets. So maybe I'm not equipped to answer that question in depth.
We'll come back to that later on when we talk
Yeah.
about Twitter and the article in the Time magazine. But let's go on to talk about other aspects of technology. Let's talk about technology and education. And we talk about technology and news then, how it's shaping the shape of news.
Mm-hmm.
Since both of you are academics, and I happen to have the pleasure of being one of your colleagues, how do you look at the notion of education being impacted by the new technology? And here we can talk more precisely of downside and upsides.
Okay. First of all, Dr. Saeed, I just want to say I'm always impressed by your knowledge of, even when we talk in our office on campus, and so it's a real honor to be here with you today and with your listeners. Technology and education, I think, as far as an upside, it's opening the door for education for many people who might not have access otherwise. People who may not be located close to a university, for example, has the opportunity to learn. I think as educators, as we do classes online, or if we do classes that are hybrid classes, a combination of in-person and online, that it's very important to create the interpersonal relationships as much as possible, to allow a forum for people to build community, so that they can develop their skills as critical thinkers and have discussions. And so it isn't a good idea just to have, let's say, a lecture that you post online and people watch, and that's it, and nobody gets to know each other. So it needs to have the interaction built in. I say preferably that people get together in person and build the relationship that way first before moving online. But if not, at least having space online to build community and have discussions back and forth, so that we don't lose that aspect.
Tell us a little more about building this community, because it looks like this new technologies have altered the framework and shape of the type of communities we built previously.
Well, it's true. Literacy is such an important part of so many of the new technologies. You need to know how to read and write. And that excludes some people and, includes people who have that ability. And so that's something that I think we need to be careful of as well. But in the educational setting where people do know how to read and write, I think, well, one thing that it does is when you post online on a discussion board, it allows the student to answer a question by going to the bookshelf and pulling out the textbook and maybe quoting, kind of like having a classroom paper that you turn in, maybe quoting a scholar and saying what they think about that and responding in much more detail than, let's say, sitting in a classroom where the professor asks a question and maybe I raise my hand and give a short answer with little thought, or maybe I just sit in the back that day and don't participate in the class. And so in the online community and classroom discussion setting, to participate in the class, you can't just be an observer because nobody will know you're there. So it requires the student to interact with the medium and actually post and have a discussion. And they also have the opportunity to have an in-depth discussion by taking an hour to put together their answer if they want, using their textbook and using their knowledge, and having this great answer to the professor's question for other students to comment on. So in that case, especially like in graduate studies, it can be a benefit when students are required to post, and then those posts are there for later access. Whereas in a classroom discussion, even though that has other benefits that online classroom discussion, once it's out of your mouth, it's gone forever unless someone has a tape recorder. So those are some of the...
It's instantly preserved.
Yeah, instantly preserved.
How do you see the notion of the entire internet being the blackboard of the whole world?
Well, I think that, to tie that with your previous question, my thoughts are directed towards Lyotard's work on, really what constitutes knowledge in this new context. And I think that this is something, first of all, that we need to acknowledge that this is something that, generally speaking, we as a civilization have wanted. We've wanted for a long time to archive our knowledge, and we've come a long way from the time when I think it was Bacon said that we could contain the entirety of all of human knowledge in 32 volumes or some such thing. But so we've come a long way from that understanding. But now what constitutes knowledge has indeed shifted. We need to know how...
that thought, and we'll continue that.
Mm-hmm.
Please bear with us. We'll be back after a short commercial break. Thank you. Sorry. Welcome back. We are talking to our colleagues about technology, its impact on societies, human relationships, economic possibilities, and educational opportunities. All of that and more. Professor Kien, you were talking about your own idea of how to look at these things. Please continue with your previous comment.
Well, I had mentioned that in keeping with Lyotard's observation about what constitutes knowledge, that one of the important transformations in education is an acknowledgement of this. And I think that as an institution, as a distributed institution, education in general has tried to respond to this change, and is, I think, now getting in a better position to actually deal with the understanding that we have that knowledge is no longer necessarily something you can get a hold of and contain, but rather knowledge is something that's out there, and the skills to find that information is really becoming the focus of a good education at this point.
Well, let me ask you a question, and that is just to probe further into it, both of you. That is, we have a genuinely global phenomena occurring now, unfolding itself, becoming more and more dense in every sense of that word. And yet when we conceptualize its impact, we think only of Western thinkers. Do you think time has come we should have Chinese and Indian and Pakistani and Mongolian thinkers also included what they're looking at? Because as we see, particularly in India, there's a very powerful now elite, intellectual elite, who are looking at issues of technology. And there's a whole range of people looking at, some people look like the author of Intimate Enemy, who is a dear friend, but his name escapes me right now. He'll come back to me in a second. He looks at from a Gandhian point of view, very critically, and almost rejectionist, very, very careful, if not fearful, and wants to move very slow because he believes this will become another dinosaur, another sort of major crisis in the society. The digital divide will deepen and create all kinds of problems. Other people are on the other side. They want to be leading this effort, not only following it. And they have created means for India and China to lead it in 20 years, if not earlier. How do we look at that possibility of expanding the academy? The academy is a Western academy. Shouldn't it also become a global academy at this time?
I absolutely agree that it should become a global academy at this time. And I agree that we need to have scholars from many different countries represented and part of the discussion. And we in the West have so much to learn from internationals because you bring with you a perspective, from your cultural background that's important and different. We need not to assume that the Western view is the dominant view, and that the West has, quote, the answers. But I do think that sometimes because of the proliferation of information in the West, we're inoculated in our own bubble, and sometimes people forget that there's many other voices out there. So we need to actively pursue, hearing different voices, and that will change the way that we think also.
I agree wholeheartedly. Yeah. It's very important that we recognize that we're in a global community academically and in terms of research.
And you have such tremendous knowledge of China. You go, I think, there every year.
I've done considerable work in China and South Korea, Japan, and I've always found a very open and eager community of scholars in my work abroad. At the same time, I also think there's an interesting issue maybe in terms of the globalization of knowledge that is yet to be explored, and that's kind of the Western appropriation of scholarly work from non-Western academics and researchers. And what I mean by that is we have a tremendous international community of scholars in the U.S. and in North America, in the West in general. And of course they're attracted here by the opportunities that our very well-developed institutions offer. And so there, from my perspective, it's not that there's not an international voice or presence in scholarship. I think that there is, but it could be considerably more acknowledged. And secondly, I think we have to acknowledge this appropriation that actually happens by the West, just by kind of an assimilation of these researchers and scholars.
Professor Kien, what you say, those who are here, by and large, I want to acknowledge there are exceptions and there are notable exceptions. Like Edward Said was a notable exception, what I'm going to say. But when you say by and large, people who are given audience in the West are those who agree with the Western paradigm to begin with. If you step outside, you're an outsider, and then you are seen as a non-scholar, second-class scholar, or something at the margins of the whole academy, which is not worth noting. Only when you are in participating in the dominant paradigm, then you are given an audience, or you have to be such a giant of a critic that they can't ignore you. Even they can sort of, ignore you, but not forever. So is that factor also there?
Well, I think it's present, yes. And I would believe that you may be able to speak to this from your own experience probably better than I would be able to. And I think that that's a serious situation that needs to be addressed.
I think one of the ways that discrimination might be institutionalized is in our journal review process. In the U.S., the high-tier journals, when it goes through peer review, a certain type of journal article is considered the correct type, following a scientific paradigm and going through certain procedures that, if you stop and think about it, are Western in their approach. And I think that might limit access to scholars who have other ways of doing things.
Yeah, I'm not so much at this stage seeking to focus on the question of discrimination, but calling your attention to the possibility that maybe this process will usher an era of revaluation of values. Our notions of, for instance, last 20 years ago, you never had an African woman declared as a Miss Universe or Miss America or something like that. Not from India. Now we have 8 women from India, Miss World and Miss Universe. Either women in India have become prettier overnight or something has changed in our conceptual framework. So it's what I call revaluation of values, a Nietzschean term. So I'm just wondering if this globalization is also going to force us to look at our values and reinscribe them with new understandings and new comprehensions instead of going with conform.
And so I had mentioned the oral tribes early on in the program today, and that sense of community. And
but what I'll say, yes, global village, but what global village meant 20 years will not mean today. People will come outsiders will be inside. Then we have a totally new understanding renegotiated by all of us, not just some of us.
Yeah.
Let me ask you a question, because we're running out of time. How do we see new technology changing the shape of news, not only the content, but the shape of news itself.
The shape of what?
News.
Oh, the shape of news.
For instance, now we have, I think, University of Minnesota is doing a study where you can listen to news on television, and as you're listening to news, you have a module, and you can say history, and you go into the history aspect of that news, while Grant goes into the economy part of the news. So you are not watching the same news anymore. You start with the same headline, but you go into totally different universes that are chosen by you. So there is no fixed news now.
Well, polarization can occur.
Well, news has always
education.
been an interesting topic to me in terms of media consumption, because we, on the whole, tend to acknowledge the importance of news, while at the same time kind of ignoring it as a media choice whenever possible. And so we acknowledge the importance of this information. At the same time, we don't want it really present, reminding us of what is really going on in the world around us. And perhaps that's a survival strategy. But I think new media changes that paradigm by revealing quite explicitly that the news we choose to consume, what we choose to be informed about, really is informed by the communities we come from, what's important to our everyday lives. It's changed from being, defined, the importance of what's going on in the world being defined by a major network or an editor's desk, to an acknowledgement that we will find what is important to us in our everyday existence.
But isn't it the case, though, that if we are selecting our own news choices, not only is there some polarization, because you might be learning entirely different things than what I'm learning, but we're lacking because we're choosing what's important. We may not know exactly what's important, and we're, the boss of our own, and so we're lacking that diversity.
But then this brings us back to the technology discussion. Now, who's not a member of Facebook, right? And who doesn't get status updates if they're on Facebook or Twitter, for example? We've formed our communities in what Baudrillard calls a neo-tribalism through electronic mediation, and we, as a electronic tribe or a neo-tribe, keep each other informed about what's important to us.
That's a good point.
In that community. And so it's not that there isn't some kind of arbiter of what's important, it's just that the power has been taken from the editor's desk to this distributed network.
Yeah. And so if we miss something, they'll fill us in on,
Right.
Because they're the...
Well, we will pay attention to each other's status updates, and we will inform each other what's important to our community.
Yeah.
And then you do better than the editor, because the editor said all the news that's fit to print.
Right,
yes.
Right.
He or she had the right to decide what's fit. Now the citizen journalist stands up and says, no, wait a minute. There's something far more important than what you're putting on the front page of the New York Times, and here it is for the people of the world. And people pay more attention to that. So the citizen journalist is beginning to alter the shape of news in terms of agenda setting and signification. And there are millions and millions of people who are signifying these things. Anybody with a camera or a pen now or a typewriter has the ability to do this thing, and that's going to change the monopoly on the news and information flow.
Yes.
And its consequences, I think, cannot be comprehended this time. Maybe 20, 30 years down the road, we'll comprehend the consequences of these changes, because these changes are so fundamental, and they're altering the structures so cohesively and so comprehensively that it's impossible even to see what will come in next.
But at the same time, the traditional method of news selection and delivery had ethical standards in place, has
Did they?
well, okay, that's open for debate, that's another discussion, but it has, supposedly claims with evidence and so forth, where the everyday person does not, if everybody becomes a newsmaker and publishes, in their blogs on the internet, let's say, that information is not necessarily true, it's not necessarily reliable, but it is the opinion of a layperson.
How will that be any different than what we heard in this country from New York Times and Washington Post about weapons of mass destruction for 2 years, and then consequently the whole country was,
It's probably healthier to have a diversity.
Diversity, and again, people are going to develop their own critical sense of things, and that's why they're forming communities. And the important thing about the neo tribe is not ethnic, it's not racial, it's not biological, it's not even national ideological. It has its own contours, it has its own sort of, and people from all over the world can join those new tribes. And the globalization and conversation around, across continent with people who are not in any way similar to you, in any sense of the word. That to me is the most enriching part of the globalization. Discovery of the new person, discovery of the new human, the matrix of communication. That I think becomes very important.
Well, I think we have a prototype for that. In fact, in the Zapatista uprising of 1994, and it's, this is of course a precursor to Twitter and the present technologies that we're using. But I think that as a case study, it can serve as a prototype of what we are in many cases experiencing now and what we might expect in the future. That suddenly a message from the middle of an otherwise unknown jungle can result in the formation of a global response. And I think that this is really the promise of the technology and the social networking era that we're in.
Yes, that's the unpredictability of this whole gameplay. This is a new kind of sort of, like a new kind of casino, where you can never predict the odds. You can never say, since my message is framed in this manner, it has all these nuances, I'm going to get this response. And I think the article on Twitter is a very good one. It says sometimes people are less interested in a philosophical message. They are more interested in knowing what you ate for breakfast that morning. Right? So this, I think this is something more fundamental, more existential, more primeval for human existence, and primordial, and we connect to that far better than we connect to these supposedly intellectual things. And therefore maybe Twitter has rediscovered, remediated something far more fundamental than we ever thought of possible this time. And what's the next frontier for technology in terms of human relation and social networking?
Well, the next frontier is, in my opinion, the next frontier is actually the social aspect. And the industry as a whole is looking at what they're calling Web 3.0, which is moving beyond social networking to the, from what I understand, the knowledge network. And it's actually settling, well, how I understand this is as a settling in of our new circumstances. But industry and I think society as a whole, perhaps even civilizationally, if we want to go the way of Harold Innis, has a huge adjustment to make at this point, because the dominating medium of our time has shifted from being text in books to digital code sitting on servers. And there are quite a number of cultural codes that this new medium suggests, such as the shift in temporality, a shift in spatiality. And so the new frontier, is really to adjust to this coming together of what we used to think of as virtual reality with physical reality. And I've made this argument in something I've written in the past, that this split between the virtual and the physical is becoming quite meaningless. We now have cars which have display screens as the windshield. So effectively, driving your car has turned into a digitally mediated experience, even more so than it already was with the computer running the engine. We're literally driving as virtualized environments. And so contending with this kind of conflation of the physical with the virtual, I think is really the new frontier. What's going to happen when we start to see other people's abandoned avatars on the side of the street? And this may sound far-fetched, but it's actually something that we may have to contend with at some point. We may have several virtual subjectivities or representations of ourselves out there as avatars working on our behalf. You may be able to do a number of things at the same time from your situated presence.
Let me ask you, in the 1.20, there was a vague suggestion of technology in support of democracy. It's democratizing the world, it's opening up, it's connecting, it's creating all these things. Is there a suggestion in 1.30, knowledge-based thing, that there is going to be knowledge hierarchies, knowledge as a source of control and manipulation, and disappearance of privacy that we talked earlier? So
Absolutely. In fact, I've just been concluding some research on the commoditization of privacy and how our media machine appropriates the labor that we do in our leisure time on sites such as Facebook or other social networking sites. This can easily become appropriated by the media machine in order to feed itself. And so the very idea of privacy and leisure is undergoing a change as well. Donald Kerr, several years ago, in fact, made this statement that the notion of privacy has changed. We can no longer get away from this media apparatus. We're pretty much always sutured into it unless we don't exist at all. And this means that, for example, we have several virtual selves out there working for us. Our bank account may be one, our social security account may be another. There's a number of different areas, and this is why identity theft is so devastating to us when it happens in this society. So,
but I'm thinking more here, less in a Karl Marx sense of appropriation and exploitation, more in the sense of Michel Foucault's concentration of power and control. And all these avenues become avenues of control. There are two very interesting books I want to have your final comments about. One is a book called Spies for Hire. And the book now argues 70% of America's intelligence work is done by private companies, not by FBI or Homeland Security or CIA. That's contracted out. And now we combine this fact with what Alvin Toffler has said in Power Shift. He said the best producer of knowledge and information is a modern corporation, not the school, not the university, but the new corporation. Combine the two and you have the results. So the modern corporation has become the information spy of the world, not the information producer, but information spy of the world. How do we look at that fact? What are that's consequences in the future?
well,
Very briefly, because I have 60 seconds.
I believe the FBI, farms out its surveillance to
IBM and other companies, large companies,
Yes.
to the Western Union.
Yes, and I think surveillance. We've very quickly come to consider surveillance a constant condition, and this relates to the issue of privacy. That we're no longer in a world in which we can retreat and have our privacy. Privacy is shifted in terms of its concept to being a campaign of identity management, and so this is really the context we're in now. Is we don't think we're going to get away from it. We need to deal with it and manage our presence.
And
I think at the same time that people need to be educated about the power of corporations and what they're doing. And people also need to be educated to make choices in their own life about how much and in what ways they choose to have technology involved in their lives so they can cultivate their lives in other ways as well.
As you can see, we just barely explored the surface of technology and its multifarious ramifications, its simultaneity in our lives, and its impact on our ways of thought, even on our brain structure. But this discussion must be continued in many settings, and I hope to bring it people from China, Russia, India, Brazil, Africa, and many other continents and countries. We'll continue this discussion in the future forums of Global Forum. Thank you.